So, welcome to our next SOHO Insider Community Oncology Brown Bag series. It's my great privilege to welcome today Dr. Krish Patel, who's the director of the lymphoma research at Sarah Cannon Research Institute. Previously, he served as the director of hematologic malignancies and cell therapy at the Swedish Cancer Institute in Seattle, Washington, where he led development of the program's clinical standards for lymphoma care, assisted in the expansion of cell therapy services, and helped shape lymphoma research efforts. He's also a member of the ASCO Cancer Communications Committee, the CIBMTR Lymphoma Working Committee, and the National Planning Committee for the Lymphoma Research Foundation Lymphoma Round. So welcome, Krish.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you, Dr. Nastoupil, for the invitation to give this presentation today. I think I want to really focus on something that is critically important in oncology today, which is how to build partnerships between academic and community oncologists. I think there's a lot of work that we're trying to do to shape clinical trials and drug development across the spectrum of clinical oncology, and these partnerships are super key. So, just an overview. I think many of you who are engaged in cancer care and clinical research understand this well, but helpful to know what the landscape of oncology care is today, why community oncologists really are an important partner in this process. Think a little bit about the models that we have that exist today, and maybe the models we want to create to get more community oncology partnership, and what some of the practical steps are and why this is important to do. So I think this won't surprise anybody, but the majority of oncology care in the United States happens in what we would call a community setting. So this is typically a non-university affiliated or perhaps affiliated to a university, but not in the main campus type setting. And this is where most Americans receive cancer care. Unfortunately, less than 20% of the clinical trials in the US are actually conducted in community oncology sites. So what that means is we have this huge gap where patients that are largely getting their care are not often able to access clinical trials. And if we think about all of the sites in the US, even those that are really enriched for clinical research, like large academic medical centers, less than 5% of US patients who have cancer enroll on clinical trials. And this is where all of our development of new therapies and knowledge generation comes from. So this is a huge gap for us to bridge. And we really need, importantly, bridges between academic and community oncologists to help kind of close this gap. What is the importance of this? I mean, this gap beyond providing access to patients for clinical trials really has a lot of significance. We know that certainly when we have clinical trials that we are looking to lead to registrational approval of new drugs, that slow enrollment really affects patient care. It leads to delayed approvals. It leads to clinical trials that cost more to run. And ultimately, all of that slows down drug development. Another important gap is that many of our clinical trials will enroll patients that may look different based on the site that they enrolled in. Eligibility criteria have typically been really designed with the input of academic investigators. That's not a fault or a criticism, but really just reflects the reality of how trials have been brought forth. And sometimes those trials may not really incorporate or reflect real-world populations, and so our ability to generalize the results of those studies might be challenged. Another consequence is that sometimes therapies that are approved might be very difficult to give because it's hard to operationalize those treatments in a different care setting where there's different infrastructure, different resources, or even different patient types. And then I think, as many of us in oncology know well, we really want to try to have the most generalizable data possible. And so if we aren't representing diverse racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic populations, then we don't really do our patients a good service in that regard. We make it difficult to generalize how a therapy might work for them. And so these are all really key consequences of having this gap or this divide between academic and community oncology when it comes to clinical research. And community oncologists and the patients in the community are really key to helping improve outcomes for all of our patients. So, historically, the traditional model has been that many academic medical centers drive clinical trial design, funding, and execution. And that's really a function of the fact that you need time to be able to do that work. And that's long been the mission of academic medical centers. But as we recognize now with just the change in the landscape of cancer care, technological changes, the changes of values of our patients, all of those things, it's really important that we also really design and develop clinical trials that can be executed in the community as well, for a variety of reasons. And so we want to think no longer about community sites really as referral sources, but potentially intellectual partners that can really help us to shape clinical trials for the better of patients and for more rapid drug development so that our patients can have better outcomes. So I want to take a moment here just to reflect on something Dr. Nastoupil asked me to, which is to think about my own experience and how I've been able to grow an experience in clinical research in a non-traditional setting. And so, like many others, I trained in a very academic environment as a trainee. And when I left that environment, I didn't really know what opportunities to do clinical research would look like or exist. And I would say that wasn't really a major focus when I first was looking for my first job out of fellowship. In fact, my original career path likely would have been to be an educator had I stayed in academic medicine, something I really enjoyed doing. But as life holds it, right? Serendipity is key, and my partner and I needed to move to a very specific part of the country, and that was in Seattle, Washington, where my wife is from. And ultimately, I was very fortunate to be able to join a program that was focused in blood cancer care that was just developing in the Swedish Cancer Institute. And I knew that blood cancer was really my passion, and lymphoma specifically, but more broadly, just to be able to focus on blood cancer care was really the only requirement I had. And so, I'd consider it serendipity that I ended up in a community practice where I could focus on blood cancer care. But when I think about the things that really were key to me, really learning how to do clinical research in a different environment and what some of the things that may have led to my being able to do that. I wanted to point out, I think, four things that are key no matter what the environment is. One was mentorship and sponsorship. I was fortunate to work with folks who had done clinical research in traditional academic models for a long time. And what those folks had learned was really key to being able to do clinical research in a different environment. They understand what academic medicine and academic medical centers were good at, but also understood what they were not so good at. Maybe things like opening trials quickly or navigating layers of bureaucracy that none of us really want or are eager to have, but may exist in academic medical centers for a variety of reasons. And importantly, came sponsorship. I think for anybody who is thinking about clinical research in the community as a bridge to our colleagues in academia, sponsorship is key, right? I think we want to be able to support each other and really be able to open up opportunities for people who have the passion, the will, and the want to build these bridges. Structure was an important part of my experience in the sense that I think it can be hard to do clinical research when you are seeing many, many different disease types. It's not impossible. But the way you engage in research is going to depend on your structure. And I was fortunate to be in a group setting where I could focus on blood cancer care. And over time, my focus became much more oriented towards lymphoma, CLL, and cellular therapy. So the intentionality of structure matters. And I think as we see in the community setting, it's really hard to keep up with everything, and large practices and are increasingly able to offer their physicians the ability to specialize. I think curiosity is a big part of this, and you have to want to do something different for your patients. And I learned that quickly as a busy clinician, where you quickly go through standard therapies that your patient have, and you need to be able to develop or be a part of offering new solutions for those patients. So my curiosity about what was happening in the world around me and what was happening in research institutions really gave me the confidence that some of these therapies we can bring to different care settings. Some we may not be able to or not want to, but just being aware of what is happening was a really, really important part of that engagement. And then the last one I'd say is that often we think about the different environment, the constraints that might be present in a non-university setting as being a weakness. But I think in a lot of ways, I came to learn that they were a strength. That perspective on what is different about being able to operationalize care in, say, a more resource-constrained environment or just an environment that has a different mission, actually became a strength, right? And if 80% of our patients are getting care in those environments, then that translates to a lot of places where tailoring clinical research or tailoring the design of new therapies to those operating environments was going to be a strength, not a weakness. And so that I think really highlights why these partnerships are so important. Community oncologists bring a lot to the table in terms of experience. The number of patients that are seen in the community is just enormous. Many folks see, many more patients than we might in subspecialized clinics because that's the number one job every day, right? Is to see patients in the clinic, and so the volume, the diversity of presentations, the access to populations that might be underrepresented in traditional academic medical centers is really important. I think feasibility is key, right? What can actually happen in the real world? We can develop the best drugs ever in clinical trials, but ultimately, if they're hard to use outside of a trial setting, that doesn't really help our patients. And so the way we design dosing schemas, the way we think about the burdens that are placed on the patient to give a certain therapy are really important. And we see that every day in the community. Our patients are often sick in different ways. They have more comorbidities. Perhaps they take a lot more medications. These are all things that are important to represent in clinical trials. And then I touched on a point that was certainly a key for me, speed. We didn't have many layers of structure to have to weave through when we first started our clinical research program in Seattle, and we were able to sort of purpose build the research system to work for speed, and that was really an advantage that became a strength for us, is to be able to open trials quickly and with a lot of efficiency. That's something that our colleagues in academic medical centers aren't always able to do. And then the last I'd say really important is increasingly we know our patients really want to receive care where they live. They trust and value the people in their own community. They trust the ability to maintain relationships with their physicians that they've had for a long time. And it's not always practical for people to be able to uproot and travel distances, sometimes very great distances, to receive cutting edge care. So this is a really important role that we in the community oncology setting have to advocate for our patients. So, as you think about how do you take all those things and then ultimately work with partners, whether they be in pharma and biotech or in academic consortia to shape better trials, I think pragmatically we can think about things like affect protocol design, things like eligibility criteria, things that one can recognize maybe serve as a barrier to community engagement but don't really impact safety. How we assess patients, the schedule that we ask patients to commit to when they come into a study. Often this is dictated by historical precedents, or sometimes by, in some ways, I'd even say heavy-handedness from regulators. And it's important to push back on and provide input on how that actually impacts patients and how that may actually deter patients from enrolling in clinical research. And then, of course, feasibility, right? Things that sometimes are possible in places that have a lot of resources can't be successfully executed in less resource-intensive environments. And so thinking about how do we tailor things like toxicity management, observation periods and studies to fit in different environments is really important. And the way that this comes through, right, is ultimately perhaps we can get more diverse patient-reported outcomes. We can get better measures of things that are important from a societal perspective, like healthcare resource utilization. And ultimately, it helps us all as researchers to focus on things that really are important, that move the needle, rather than things that might be, academically interesting to us, but ultimately don't impact patient care as much as we would like. And so I think these are all ways in which community input has been important. A partnership in the clinical research space. And some of the examples of existing partners that I think many are not aware of are there are lots of ways to be engaged, right? I think the NCI really supports community oncology research programs. This doesn't have to be something that people do as a standalone. There are regional NCORPs that, broadly speaking, their mission is to connect community oncology practices with meaningful clinical trials. all of our cooperative groups, community sites can join as affiliates or full members. That might offer an opportunity to join a like-minded group of investigators who can really help to provide a mentorship, sponsorship, and then also that we all can learn from one another. And then certainly there are pharma studies that are increasingly focused in the community, especially as US enrollment becomes really important for our regulators. And then I think importantly, here we still have some work to do, but gaining a voice from the community oncologists who operationalize treatments and things like steering committees and clinical trial designs are all ways that we can think about building these partnerships. So whether you're on the academic medical side of the house, the industry side, or the community side, I think these are things that we want to voice as important to helping improve not only the volume but the output of clinical research in the US. I wanted to think about some examples where community perspectives have really influenced drug development, and I've been fortunate to be doing this for a little more than a decade now, and we've had some amazing therapeutic advances in the world of lymphoma, but not all of them were really purpose-built or operationalizable in their first instances. And so as we've sort of seen the evolution of bispecific antibody development, certainly from our community colleagues, the need to be able to use these drugs in an outpatient model has led to things like optimized step-up dosing, different prophylaxis regimens. That's certainly seen in the myeloma world, where community oncology trials have actually led the development of prophylactic tocilizumab to be able to offer these therapies in freestanding cancer clinics. Things like even as simple as staggering how we introduce drugs, right, to minimize the requirements for inpatient monitoring for things like BCL2 inhibitors. All of these things are often voiced by our community colleagues and then iteratively help us to kind of shape and reshape how we deliver these therapies. And as we think about something as complex as cellular therapy, really for this to really impact the broadest number of patients, our community colleagues have to be involved in the development of the next generation of these therapies, thinking about, operational models. How do we actually operate a trial where perhaps somebody needs to be in a specialized center that delivers cell therapy, but the standard of care arm can be delivered in the community setting? That may not be something we all think about every day, but that can actually be a barrier to enrollment in trials. If where patients are getting two different therapies differs, does that become a barrier for trials? So partnerships there can help us to think about advancing clinical research. And then certainly, as we're all kind of probably aware of, trying to provide more flexibility in clinical research for what kinds of centers can participate in what kinds of studies. Do you always need to be FACT accredited for allotransplant, for example, to be able to participate in a CAR T study when CAR T cell therapies are being given in some community centers? These are the kinds of things where the partnership between community oncologists is really vital. That voice is needed to help kind of make sure that we're providing broad access to our patients and that we're helping shape drug delivery in an important way. So I put this here as if you just think about, what are some of the things that need to happen to be able to engage in research. And I won't go through these in detail, but just to say you have to have some foundations, right? You have to have a structure in place to be able to do clinical research in a good way. And ultimately, many people might need to grow some experience as an investigator to understand what are the responsibilities of being an investigator. What does that mean? There are ways to do that by joining other trials that might be ongoing at your centers or through cooperative groups. And then as you're doing that work, being engaged in those efforts. So not necessarily just thinking I have to enroll patients on the study, but to actually be engaged with the trial from a development standpoint and seek an opportunity to provide input. I think we all recognize there's a lot of barriers that can exist in a different care environment, and in particular, time was one of them. When I was starting in my career, I was seeing patients 4 days a week in the clinic, and my colleagues in different environments weren't. And so I didn't have protected time to do clinical research. But what we found is that we need to align our research activities, right? The activity of enrolling patients on a study, assessing AEs, doing those things in real time. And there are ways to do that in normal clinic flows that help to try to maximize and optimize the time one has. Infrastructure I mentioned is something that can feel daunting, but starting small and then being able to grow and being really focused on what you take on and what you don't can be a really valuable experience and something that again I think is well within the opportunity for a lot of practices around the country. The practical aspects are also important. Community oncology models are driven by different goals, right? First, practice has to be sustainable. So you need to be aware that, trials can vary tremendously in terms of their impact financially. And most trials, when well managed, can be at least revenue neutral or revenue positive. And maybe that's necessary to convince folks within the community structures that investing in research is a good idea. And then, of course, the expertise comes with time and experience and being engaged. And I think ultimately, we're always going to have a need for patients to go back and forth between community oncology sites and academic medical centers for varied reasons in oncology. But I think collaboration is really key, right? Trying to keep the patients in the community that can be served by clinical trials that are purpose-built to engage in the community care and really leaving the bandwidth of our colleagues in academic medical centers to bring on and bring forth clinical trials where they are uniquely able to provide the care that's needed to advance those therapies is important. We can't all do everything, and we have to be really, I think, in partnership with one another to kind of advance things for all of our patients. So, I think there's a lot of exciting things happening, and when we think about the future of community and academic partnerships and clinical research, there's a lot to be excited about. Decentralized clinical trials, the potential for hybrid trial operations models, et cetera, where patients can increasingly get more of their care at home, and we can leverage technological solutions to bring these different parts of the healthcare system together. And so I think ultimately these partnerships are so key because we need these trials to enroll faster. We need the data that we generate to reflect the types of patients we expect to receive these medicines after regulatory approvals. And I think ultimately there is certainly a will and a want for many in the community to contribute intellectually to drug development and clinical research from the very earliest time points that make sense, like protocol design for late phase trials, et cetera. And so we all have to kind of advocate for one another to do this. And I've been fortunate to know many folks in the academic medical community and in my own communities who have helped to sponsor and support that vision. And so we all have to kind of work together to do this for the betterment of our patients. So I think, I'll just end by saying that there are a lot of benefits for community oncologists to be engaged in the process of clinical research and to partner with academic medical centers to really complement one another. And engagement is a key part of that, but there are multiple ways that you can get involved. And ultimately, that's what led me to join a community oncology focused research organization. And so I know that this is something that is more accessible to many of you than you might think, and it's important that you partner with us. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very nice overview. And I think you're the perfect example of someone who's clearly been successful in conducting clinical research, but also is well respected as an expert in the field and has a voice at the table. I just want to remind everyone that the Q&A is open for questions. And as people may think about that, I want to maybe do a little bit of a deeper dive. How do you foster those mentorship, sponsorship relationships? It may be easier for someone who's coming straight out of training and has that tether to a mentor, but what about someone who has an established practice and would really like to get involved in clinical research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think most of us are probably able to identify people that we have either referred patients to or shared part or asked advice of, right? We all have had those moments. And so I think that's one area I would say, Loretta, where I think thinking about who are those experts in your area that you can think of and reach out to. I'm sure they are all very, very busy and would be very happy to have patients be able to access care in their own community settings. I think the other are really, are organizations, right? Like SOHO, like ASH. There is an increasing focus, even like ASTCT, on community engagement. And so all of these professional societies, I think, are great ways for us to be able to connect with colleagues who maybe are some years removed from training, but are still very eager to kind of advance the research for their patients.
And I really like your idea of sort of starting small, get some experience under your belt, and then see how things go. I think one maybe challenge is that infrastructure is not oftentimes sponsored,
Right.
particularly by community sites. As you said, they're resource restricted. So how do you go about finding the funding source to hire a coordinator, for instance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think here too, there are growing initiatives, for example, from both our pharma colleagues as well as from professional societies or patient advocacy groups, grant funding that can be applied for to enhance community oncology research, like from Blood Cancer United or Lymphoma Research Foundation. And those I think are great seed efforts to start small, maybe hire a coordinator, be able to cover costs of things like submission fees to a central IRB. And those things I think can then very quickly, depending on how well we execute, can grow and then sort of feed themselves, right? They give you the opportunity to kind of get the next round of support, whether that's internally from your health system or more external funding.
And then how do you foster information sharing with your community sites? And maybe they don't want to be an investigator or
Right.
sub-investigator in a study, or they never going to have the research infrastructure to do it, but they clearly want to partner with someone like you who has a very robust portfolio. How do they know what trials you have open? How do they know what patients might be potentially eligible for studies or what you're prioritizing at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd say, maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned in that way, but I think being available and accessible, right? Sharing your phone number with people, going out into the community to understand the care settings that those folks are in. So if you have somebody who, refers you a lot of patients and you, have developed a relationship, go visit them, see what that practice setting is like, build those relationships so that they feel comfortable to call you and ask you, hey, I've got this frontline patient that seems really sick. Do you have a trial for this person? Rather than I'm just going to give them standard therapy every single time, they feel comfortable to do that. So I think, rubbing elbows is a good way to start.
Well, I sure appreciate you spending time with us today. And again, I can't think of someone who is more humble in how huge of a role you have had in shaping current studies in lymphoma, but also being the voice of reason for how do we get these therapies into the community where most of these patients, as you mentioned, are being treated. And I really appreciate your efforts to make sure we have broader representation on our clinical trials. So again, thank you and keep doing such a great job. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to let everyone know to join us next month, May 15th at 11:30 Eastern Time. We'll be speaking with Jeff Sharman from US Oncology. I think that conversation will dovetail nicely with all of the things that you've highlighted today, but really exploring barriers and solutions for activating and sustaining research programs in non-academic environments. So again, thank you, Dr. Patel. We really appreciate your time and expertise today.